Chapter 304 The Enslaved Bride, Part 1. It was in mid-June when the dark clouds of autumn poured down water over the small village, Taala, where Ian was born, raised, and lived for 19 years. There was nothing that troubled Ian and her people more than the rain. Everything could happen when the sky got angry and sent down lightnings and thunderstorms and flood. In a twinkling of an eye a hut might take off and fly like the feathers of a dead eagle and leave its inhabitants coverless. A fire from the sky might set the hut on flames and send everyone out in the street. Nevertheless, nothing was dreaded more by the poor villagers than the flood. Worse than any other natural disasters, the flood could damage the entire village and sometime wipe it and its inhabitants out of existence. So, on that fateful morning, Ian, her parents, 2 brothers, and baby sister clustered themselves near the door of their old hut and waited for heaven to decide their destiny. The sky emptied throughout the night and continued into the early morning. The old and wise men and women of the village warned the young and foolish boys and girls about the possibility of a devastating flood. The village was set at the foot of a high mountain. The water was expected to have collected throughout the night and soon or later it would flood the village. The sound of the thunder made it difficult to know whether the flood was approaching or not. While the poor villagers were waiting for the heaven to pass its judgment on their sins, the loud explosions of bombs and gunshots changed the atmosphere, as if the gods modified their old ways of punishing the poor southerners and used man-made devices to carry out their wrath on the so-called enemies of Allah. For sometimes, the wise and the foolish people alike were confused and did not know whether to run, hide, or wait for their death. A wise man who had lived somewhere else before escaping to the village knew what was going on and shouted to Ian's father to run for his life. "The Janjaweed," shouted the man. If he said the ruthless soldiers of Al-Zubair Basha came back to life and were about to attack the village in order to rape the women and subject men into slavery, or else the savage troops of Abdullah al-Sarah who brought the curses of the Arabs' religion to Sudan, resurrected from hell and invaded the village and about to convert people to Islam by the sword, Ian and her parents would not have so dreaded the news. The Arab Janjaweed came that morning not only to abuse and kill Ian and her people, but also to rape the village itself. Their dirty feet and deadly weapons set every hut into flames and destroyed everything the villagers had. They rode on horses and carried very sophisticated machine guns. They masked their faces with black turbans that made them look like devils on horses' backs. The term Janjaweed is erroneously translated in English as warriors on horses. If translated literally, the word Janjaweed means devils on horses' backs. The southern Sudanese people called the Janjaweed, Marahil, which means nomadic tribes. The Janjaweed are organized militias of the northern Arab tribes such as Al-Mizriya and Al-Rizagate, who live in the western region of Darfur in Sudan. These militias are armed by the Khartoum Islamic government with the pretense to protect the region from the attack of the southern rebels and the Darfurian rebels. The Janjaweed's raids to the Dinka villages are going on from time immemorial. The Janjaweed became notorious for racist rhetoric, massacre, rape, and forced displacement in 2003 to 2007. In the province of Darfur, the Janjaweed have been launching raids, bombings, and attacks on villages, killing civilians based on ethnicity, raping women, stealing lands, goods, and herds of livestock. On that black morning, in a few minutes, many people and animals were massacred and everyone was chased out of his hiding place. The black Arabs appeared to Ian as black demons that carried death on their hands. She saw with her own eyes her parents gunned down and her 2 brothers stabbed to death. Her baby sister was trodden under feet and struggled for a few seconds before she gave up her soul. Ian fell on her knees and waited for the bullets of the Arabs. There was nothing that could relieve her from the terrible pain that filled her chest except for death. In that critical moment, Ian shouted to God, cried for her family, and pleaded for mercy, but heaven shut its gates and God turned his face away. Why had the rain stopped at that moment? Why hadn't the flood come to wipe away the conqueror and the conquered? Yes, it was God who seemed to have helped the Arabs to defeat the so-called enemies of Allah. History seemed to have repeated itself, and the army of al-Rahman had been aided by the angelic troops, as was believed to have happened in the Battle of Badr al-Kubra when the Prophet Muhammad had preached his belief in the desert of Arabia. When the victory of Allah has come, you have no defeat, thus said Allah the Great in the Quran. That was the way in which the Janjaweed interpreted their victory on that fateful morning. Unfortunately, Ayan was neither killed nor raped to death, but was taken captive as a slave girl. It was the soldier who killed her family members who spared her and later on claimed her as his Jariya, or female slave. When the raiders finished their brutal slaughter of the men, the women, and the children, they tied up the young girls together and forced them to stand in long rows. Ayan was sandwiched somewhere in the first row. Her eyes were reddened and swollen by the smoke of the burning huts and her continuous tears. Her many tears could not rid her of the grief that was eating her chest like a cancer. She knew she had to live with it the rest of her miserable life. How could she ever forget such a day on which the members of her dear family were butchered in front of her eyes like animals? She hated that wicked Arab man who did not hesitate to stamp his dirty feet on the delicate body of her innocent baby sister. She could not forget how her old parents begged for their lives when they were dragged out of the hut and shot in the heads. She could not erase the images of the hundreds of old men and women of the village who were killed by the bullets of the Arabs. From morning until noon, Ayan and the other girls stood on their feet and waited for the Arabs to gather their spoils and destroy the rest of the village. No men were spared. Many children were strangled and trodden under feet. Old women were likewise gotten rid of. Those who were wounded by stray bullets were dragged out of the huts and shot through the head. Only the young and strong girls were spared. By noontime, the sun was able at last to clear the dark sky and smoke and shine everywhere. It was a blessing and a curse to the captives. They had neither eaten nor quenched their thirst since the sky rained down those black demons on their village. The hot sun dried up the liquid in their bodies and caused some of them to faint. Ayan was a young, tall, strong, and beautiful girl. She could resist the blazing sun for a while. The Arabs dragged the unconscious girls to the trees. No one of them tried to find out who was dead or dying among the fainted girls. The Arabs had more things to loot. They were still busy searching for gold and money under the ruins. For the vultures and wild beasts of the jungle, they left the dead bodies of the villagers and animals, but for the southern rebels they left nothing. Even the local weapons, such as spears, axes, swords, and daggers were collected. Ayan was almost dragging her feet when the Arabs ordered her and the other girls to move forward. They were all tied together with ropes and marched in line behind the Janjaweed. Some of the Arabs carried whips in their hands and slashed the body of any girl who slacked behind. Ayan fell on her face and could not stand by herself. The whip cut her delicate body like a sharp sword. Her voice failed her when she tried to cry. A strong girl knelt over her body and helped her to stand on her feet. With eyes flooded with tears, Ayan began to move away from her village. She advanced physically, but her soul continued to cling to her old village. Over her head she saw the vultures hovered in the sky, waiting to feast on the dead bodies of her people. On that fateful day, Ayan recalled the day on which she was engaged to her future husband. Only a couple of months were left before she would receive her visa and ticket and fly to her husband in America. Although she was married to him, she had not seen him for years. She had little memory of him when he was a 10-year little boy. Ever since he left the village and moved to the town, Ayan had not seen him again. She heard that he finished his school and went to the big city of the Arabs to learn more. A few years later she heard that he traveled to India to join the university. Eventually she learned that Malwal had become a refugee and immigrated to America. Among all the boys who left the village and went to the towns, Ayan was interested in no one except Malwal. She always enjoyed hearing news about him. One day she heard some news, which made her sweat from head to foot. Malwal had sent a letter to his parents and asked for the hand of Ayan, the daughter of Mr. Majok. She liked the news but pretended to be troubled by it. It was a proper behavior in Sudan for a girl to act angry when she heard that someone was going to marry her. Then, Ayan's parents asked that Malwal send money equivalent to the price of 100 cows. Each cow was priced at $100. So, once Malwal sent 10,000 American dollars, the elders of the village met and conducted the marriage of Ayan to him. 1 year had passed since Ayan got married to Malwal. For some time Malwal could not convince the immigration authorities in the states that he actually got married to a Sudanese girl without his presence. How could he marry a girl in his village when he did not visit his country for 7 years? So, he was asked to supply substantial evidence that he had contact with her either through written correspondence or phone calls. For 6 months Malwal corresponded with his new bride and hence gathered enough proof. Finally the immigration authorities were convinced that he was in love with the girl in question and had actually married her. As soon as Malwal got the visa he wrote to his bride and informed her about the good news. Unfortunately, by then Malwal was totally broke. He spent every single dollar he earned on his bride and her family. He requested his bride to wait at least for a few months until he could earn or borrow $2,000 to purchase her ticket. Besides that, Malwal was expected to host a party when his bride arrived in the States and invite at least 500 Sudanese people so that his community could recognize his marriage. He had to feed all 500 guests including their little ones and those who would just show up without being invited. In fact, the unexpected guests were always more in number than those who were officially invited. Moreover, the pastor of the Sudanese church asked Malwal to bring his bride to the church before the party to be blessed by God. As he would bless the couple spiritually, the pastor would expect them to bless him financially. So far, Malwal had finished his 2 credit cards, borrowed money from people, and taken out a loan from the bank. A month had passed since he sent the ticket to his new bride. The bride Ayan and the other captive girls continued to follow the Janjaweed to their native town. Some girls could not stay on their feet for the 1-week walk. Those judged by the Arabs to be weak and dying were left behind for the wild beasts and the vultures to feast on before they were even fully dead. The most painful and humiliating experience in life was to be a slave. Slavery, thanks to God, had been abolished all over the world except in Sudan, Saudi Arabia, and Mauritania. Allah in Islam seemed to be very adamant and stubborn, for he swore by himself and would not repent that as long as he lived man had the right to marry up to 4 wives at the same time and sleep with his slave girls without marrying them. How could he change his mind when he promised 72 slave virgins in paradise for his faithful who are ready and willing to blow themselves up for his cause? Ayan had never walked such a long distance in all her life. For 3 days she walked along with the other girls, hardly having eaten any food or drunk any water. They walked most of the day and rested at night. At night a fire was lit by their captors to keep away the wild beasts. Dangerous creatures such as snakes and scorpions were as common in the jungle as the flies. Some of the girls were struck by snakes and scorpions at night and in the morning were discovered to be dead or dying. They were left for the vultures and the beasts to finish the job. On the 4th day, Ayan and her friends were faced with a problem that was more serious than what they had experienced so far. Based on an old war custom that the captive girls were supposed to be given 3 days to mourn their dead relatives before their masters would sleep with them. Being ignorant of such a war custom, Ayan and her friends thought that their masters were following rare morals and would not touch them unless they married them. On the 4th day, as the hyena would wait patiently for its prey to fall asleep, so the Arabs waited for the 3 days to pass before they began to rape their captive girls. Some tribes in Sudan had changed the moral laws by making evil to be good and wrong to be right. For instance, there was a tribe in which a man was not allowed to marry unless he broke into someone's house or shop and stole. Another tribe would not give their daughter in marriage except to the man who would kill another man and shows the blood of his victim on his spear or sword. Although these customs were not lawful in Sudan, they are still being followed until today. But, these customs are nothing if compared to the behavior of a group of people who took great pride in stealing and killing. Their acts are well honored in Sudan. Some of their men are highly praised and hence thousands of poems and songs were written to honor their so-called courageous deeds. Those heroes were mentioned in great novels and sometimes their stories were reenacted on the radio and TV and theaters. Those men of honor were known as the Hambada. The term Hambada has no equivalent in English language and the nearest meaning is armed robbers. Two Hambada who were outstanding heroes in the history of Sudan were called Wad Tahiya and Asha al-Baitat. Many novels and poems were written in description of the courageous acts of Wad Tahiya. What had Wad Tahiya done to deserve such an honor? Wad Tahiya and his gang used to behave like Robin Hood and attack caravans and shepherds in the wilderness and rob their cattle and money. If that what the great Hambati, Wad Tahiya had done, then what was honorable and praiseworthy of his deeds? Was not that what the Janjaweed had done to Ayan and her family? But if you asked this question to anyone in Sudan, he would tell you that Wad Tahiya was a brave man because he used to carry out his actions in a courageous way. It is difficult to explain this in words, but could be better demonstrated in action. Before we go into that, we must check who was the famous Hambati at the time the bride of Malwal was taken captive. Wad Mira bint Aboud was the most famous Hambati in Darfur when the Janjaweed stole Ayan and her friends from their village. Whether it was a coincidence or he had a mother by that name, Mira bint Aboud was the most honored woman in the history of Sudan due to her courageous deeds at the time of war. Through her songs and shout of war, the Sudanese troops were able to fight courageously against such strong armies like the British and the Turks. Some people believed that Wad Mira had inherited the spirit of courage and bravery from the mother of the nation, Mira bint Aboud. In one of his honorable encounters with his victims, Wad Mira was believed to have uttered the following courageous words. "We, the Hambada, are well known. Without the deeds of men we have no other acts. We do not creep for it, but we take it with a red eye. We do not steal like a thief at night or from the rear. We approach it like a lion and take it from its owner." The Hamda did not consider themselves to be thieves or robbers but men of valor, and society agreed. The man who would come across them in the wilderness was doomed. On the sixth day, the Janjaweed reached the border of their province and had to travel another day to enter their town. On the previous day, they had rested for many hours before resuming their journey. By then, Ayan and the other girls were turned into sex slaves. They were beaten often, raped regularly, and forced to cook the food. They walked on foot for 6 days, dragging their exhausted bodies. They were starved purposely to prevent attempts of escape. The Janjaweed used sticks and whips to punish any girl who showed resistance or disobedience. On that day, towards the sunset, the Janjaweed encountered a group of Hambada led by Wad Mira. It was as if the earth was suddenly opened and Satan and his demonic host emerged out of the bottomless pit. 5 men on camels against 25 men on horses might not look like a fair match. Nevertheless, the 25 Janjaweed viewed Wad Mira and his 4 men as they would 5,000's troops. "Salamu alaikum Shiwak al-Arab," greeted Wad Mira with a voice as loud as thunder. None of the Janjaweed uttered a word. Their voices were sealed with fear. They were like a deer that suddenly heard a roar of a lion within her reach. "I want the women and the cattle," continued Wad Mira, "and if you think that is unfair deal, I will take your horses also and make you walk on foot to your town." "We traveled deep into the south of Sudan and fought with courageous and brave men before we defeated them and took their women and cattle," said the leader of the Janjaweed. "So, you believe that you have enough courage and strength to fight against Wad Mira and his men?" Wad Mira folded his arms, a sneer furrowing his brow. "We are Arabs and Muslims like you, and we also believe in the oneness of Allah. We should fight against the enemies of Allah and not among ourselves." Although the Janjaweed spoke with confidence, their fear betrayed them in the shifting of eyes, the shuffling of feet. "I am a Hambati and fighting against men is my profession." Wad Mira jumped off his camel and strutted back and forth in front of the Janjaweed, his chest pushed out in pride. "Even if the Prophet Muhammad's troops came across me, I will fight them and take what they have." He stopped and faced his opponents with a ferocious scowl. The Janjaweed put their heads together for a moment and discussed with gestures and low murmurs. The leader nodded and said to Wad Mira, "Take the cattle and leave the women for us." Wadmira swung one strong leg over his camel and pulled himself up. A rifle appeared in his left hand. I want the women, the cattle, and your horses, and if you don't want to see the sunrise tomorrow, try to stop me. Before the leader of the Janjaweed could bargain further, he heard gunshots and saw 10 of his men were shot dead and fell off their horses. No one fired a bullet at them except Wadmira. Now you are 15 men and I am 1. Come down from your horses and let us put on a show before these daughters of the Dinka tribe. The 15 Janjaweed were forced to get off their horses and throw away their weapons. Then they waited for Wadmira like a god, to decide their destiny. Wadmira unarmed himself and jumped off his camel. You are 15 and I am 1. Come all of you and wrestle with me. If you are able to put me down, I will let you go and take nothing from you. I am Wadmira bit about, and I have given you my word in front of my men and these Dinka girls. The leader of the Janjaweed sent 3 of his men to fight against the huge man who was standing like a mountain before him. Wadmira took the first man and used him as a stick to hit the other 2. The 2 men fell half dead in front of the Hambati man. To display more of his strength, Wadmira swung the stick man 3 times over his head and threw him away. Like being shot off a sling, the stick man fell a few meters away behind the Dinka girls. The leader fell on his knees and begged, "Please, take everything, only spare our lives."